trunk hit the mud with a sound like a gunshot. Georgia Wilcox stood in the downpour outside the Caldwell Creek Stage Depot, watching her entire life, 3 dresses, her mother's Bible, a small tin of dried lavender, and every letter she had received from a man named Harlan Webb sink slowly into the red Oklahoma clay. The stage had pulled away without warning, the driver not even looking back, and the rope securing her trunk to the rear luggage rack had simply given out. Snapped. Like a promise. Like every promise that had ever been made to her. She was 24 years old, 1,000 miles from Cincinnati, and the man who was supposed to be standing at this depot to receive her was nowhere in sight. Harlan Webb, who had written her 17 letters over the course of 8 months, who had described his ranch in terms so beautiful she had pressed his words against her chest at night like a remedy. Harlan Webb had not come. A boy from the telegraph office pushed through the depot door and looked at her with the particular sympathy of someone delivering news that is already too late. He held a folded paper out and ran back inside before she could speak. She opened it with hands that were shaking partly from the cold and partly from something much older and much harder than cold. Miss WLCOX Harlan Webb married DOROTHY FRANE of Enid last Saturday. WSHESU safe travels back. Do not come to the ranch HW. The paper went soft in the rain. The ink bled. Georgia stood there in the downpour, reading the telegram 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something survivable. They did not. She did not cry. She had cried enough in her life. When her father lost everything in the panic of 1873, when her mother died of fever the following winter, when she had agreed to become a correspondent bride for a man she had never met because there was simply nothing left in Cincinnati that wanted her. She had used up her tears on smaller betrayals than this one. This one required something different. This one required her to simply stand in the rain and breathe and figure out what a woman does when the last door she had counted on turns out to have no room behind it at all. That was when she heard the footsteps, not the hollow hurry of someone ducking out of the rain. These were slow, deliberate, unhurried steps, the kind that belonged to someone who had been watching for a while and had decided, after considerable internal debate, to involve himself. She did not turn around at first. She heard him set something down. Then she heard him crouch beside her trunk, and when she finally looked, she saw a man with his back to her, examining the broken rope with the concentration of a surgeon. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat that was already soaked through. His hat was dark with rain. His hands, and she noticed his hands immediately because they were the first thing she always noticed about a man, were large and careful and completely unhurried. He stood. He picked up her trunk. The whole thing. 112 pounds of everything she owned, she would later calculate. He picked it up with the ease of a man lifting a saddlebag and said, without turning around, "The Caldwell Creek Hotel is 3 miles up the North Road. I expect that is where you need to go." "I do not know you," Georgia said. He turned then and she saw his face for the first time. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or 2 past it, with dark eyes and a jaw that looked like it had been struck by several things over the years and had refused to yield to any of them. He was not handsome in the way of catalog illustrations. He was handsome in the way of something that had been worn down to its essential shape by weather and work and time. "Gideon Cooper," he said. "I have a farm 2 miles south of here. I was at the depot collecting feed orders." He paused. "The rain is not letting up. I am perfectly capable of—" "I know you are," he said, and he started walking. He did not wait for her to agree. He did not ask her again. He simply picked up her trunk, 112 pounds of her collapsed life, and walked north in the rain. And after a moment of furious, helpless, thoroughly exhausted deliberation, Georgia Wilcox picked up her carpetbag and followed him. 3 miles. He walked all 3 of them without complaint, without slowing, without once setting the trunk down to rest. The rain did not let up. The North Road was clay and ruts and standing water in the low places, and he navigated it without hesitation, holding her trunk clear of the worst of the mud on the inclines, adjusting his grip on the downhill stretches. She walked beside him. She did not speak for the first mile. By the second mile she had begun to understand something. Not everything. Not yet, but something. He did not ask her why she was at the depot alone. He did not ask her why no one had come to meet her. He did not ask what was in the telegram she had folded into her coat pocket, though he had certainly seen her reading it. He asked her nothing. He simply carried her trunk. And in the space of 3 rain-soaked miles, with the Oklahoma mud pulling at her boots and the sky the color of a bruise and everything she had planned in ruins behind her, Georgia Wilcox understood something about Gideon Cooper that she could not yet put into words. She knew what kind of man waited for a woman to explain herself before helping her. She knew what kind of man helped only when the help would be witnessed and credited. She knew what kind of man made a performance of his own goodness, announcing it before and after and during. Gideon Cooper had not done any of those things. He had simply picked up her trunk and walked. She knew then who he was. She did not know yet that she was going to fall in love with him. But standing outside the Caldwell Creek Hotel, watching him set her trunk down on the covered porch with the same careful quietness with which he had lifted it, she felt something shift in the architecture of her chest, some wall she had built in a great hurry after 17 letters from a man who had married someone else shift, just slightly, on its foundation. "Thank you," she said. "It was no trouble," he said. He said it the way people only say things when they are completely true. Then he tipped his hat and walked back into the rain. She watched him go until the gray curtain of the downpour swallowed him up. Then she sat down on her trunk on the porch of the Caldwell Creek Hotel, in the Indian Territory of Oklahoma in the autumn of 1880, and she thought for the first time in 8 months that she might not, after all, want to go back to Cincinnati. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek on the 14th of October, 1880, on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe line, having changed stages twice and spent 3 nights sleeping upright in various combinations of horse-smelling coaches. She had packed her trunk in Cincinnati with the careful precision of someone who knows they are not coming back. She had not told anyone she was going except Mrs. Horace Pemberton, her landlady, who had pressed a coin into her hand and said, "God keeps an eye on the brave ones, dear," which Georgia had found both comforting and statistically uncertain. The plan had been Harlan Webb. Harlan Webb was a cattle rancher in the Cherokee Outlet, 38 years old, twice widowed, with no children and a prose style in letters that was, Georgia had to admit, genuinely moving. He had described the Oklahoma sky in ways that made Cincinnati's coal smoke ceiling feel like a punishment. He had described loneliness with an honesty she had respected. He had asked her, over the course of many months and many letters, whether she might consider becoming his wife, and she had said yes, and she had packed her trunk, and she had come. And he had married Dorothy Frayne of Enid last Saturday. The Caldwell Creek Hotel was a 2-story frame building that smelled of pine resin and coal oil and the specific animal warmth of too many people in too few rooms. The proprietor, a woman named Mrs. Edna Hooper, who wore her gray hair pinned so severely it appeared to be holding her face together by force, looked at Georgia with eyes that had seen every variety of stranded woman and had developed opinions about all of them. "Room and board is $1.50 a week," Mrs. Hooper said. "Meals are included. I do not allow gentlemen callers after 7 in the evening, and I do not allow drinking in the rooms." "I have no gentlemen callers," Georgia said. Mrs. Hooper looked at her for a long moment. "You will," she said, and led her upstairs. The room was small and clean. It had a window that faced east and a quilt in a pattern Georgia recognized as log cabin, done in blues and browns. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and took the telegram out of her pocket and looked at it for the last time. Then she folded it very small and placed it in the tin with her mother's dried lavender. She did not know why she kept it. Perhaps because she had learned early that the evidence of a betrayal is a useful thing to carry. It keeps you from forgetting what you survived. She slept that night for 11 hours, which was the most she had slept in months, and when she woke the rain had stopped and the Oklahoma sky outside her window was the precise shade of blue that Harlan Webb had described in his very first letter, and she thought, with a feeling that surprised her by being almost like relief, he was right about the sky, at least. The town of Caldwell Creek in 1880 was a community of perhaps 400 souls, perched at the edge of the Cherokee Outlet where the cattle trails crossed. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a bank, a church of the Methodist persuasion, a one-room schoolhouse, a doctor's office, the hotel, a telegraph office, and 3 saloons, which Georgia noted was a ratio of moral establishments to immoral ones that seemed honestly representative of the human condition. She found work within a week. The schoolhouse had been without a teacher since August, when the previous one, a young man named Albert Greer, had been offered a position in Wichita and had taken it with the speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this escape route. The school board, which consisted of 4 men who met in the back of the general store and collectively knew very little about education, but a great deal about the difficulty of finding anyone willing to teach for $30 a month, hired Georgia after a 10-minute interview during which she demonstrated that she could read, write, perform arithmetic through long division, and recite the names of all the United States territories without consulting a map. She began teaching the following Monday. There were 19 children, ranging in age from 6 to 14, with the entire range of frontier childhood's particular difficulties. Some had never been to school before, some had attended intermittently and developed interesting gaps in their knowledge, and 2 were the children of a Cheyenne woman married to a local farmer, who spoke English as a second language and understood most things faster than anyone else in the room. Georgia taught school and boarded at Mrs. Hooper's hotel and organized her life with the precision of someone building something deliberately, not merely passing time. She learned the town. She learned who was trustworthy and who required careful handling. She learned that Caldwell Creek had its own intricate social architecture, as every small place does, with its allegiances and its resentments, and its secrets that everyone knew but no one named aloud. She did not see Gideon Cooper again for 2 weeks. When she did, it was at the general store on a Tuesday morning in late October. She was buying chalk and a box of the steel-nibbed pens she used for the older students' penmanship lessons. He was at the counter collecting what appeared to be a substantial order of flour, salt pork, and nails, and he did not see her immediately. She watched him for a moment before he noticed her. He spoke to the storekeeper, a round, cheerful man named Patterson, with a directness that was neither rude nor warm, simply efficient. He checked the order against a list he had written in a hand she could see from across the room was careful and precise. He did not chat. He did not perform sociability. When he turned and saw her, something moved across his face. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like confirmation. "Miss Wilcox," he said. "Mr. Cooper," she said. "I wanted to thank you again for your help. I did not have the opportunity properly before." "You thanked me," he said. "I did not thank you adequately." A pause, short and not uncomfortable. "Are you settled?" he asked. "The hotel is treating you well. I have taken a room for now and a position teaching school," she said. "I am settled enough." Something changed in his expression then. It was a small change, barely perceptible, but Georgia had spent her life reading small changes in people's faces. It was one of the skills you develop when you grow up in a household where the emotional weather shifts without warning, and she caught it. It was not what she expected. It was not pity, which she had braced herself for. It was not the particular knowing look of someone who had heard about Harlan Webb's telegram and was cataloging her as a cautionary tale. It looked, if she was reading it correctly, like respect. "That is very good," he said. Simple as that. Then he picked up his order, said good morning to Patterson, nodded to her, and left. She stood at the counter holding her chalk and her steel-nibbed pens and felt, once again, that slight shift in some internal architecture, as if something that had been closed was not yet open but had perhaps become less thoroughly sealed. Patterson, who had been watching all of this with the bright-eyed attention of a man who runs the community's central information exchange, said, "Gideon Cooper is a good man. Best farmer in the county, some say. Keeps to himself mostly since." He stopped himself with the abruptness of someone who remembers just too late that some sentences are not his to finish. Georgia looked at him. Patterson polished a jar with excessive attention. "Good man," he repeated, and told her what she owed for the chalk and pens. Since what, she wondered, walking back to the schoolhouse in the sharp October air. Since what? She found out, as one finds out most things in a small town, through accumulated fragments rather than any single account. A word from Mrs. Hooper. A mention in passing from Margaret Hartley, the preacher's wife, who had a gift for conveying significant information while appearing to discuss nothing more consequential than weather. A sentence from old Bill Drury, who had the land adjacent to Cooper's farm and who spoke about his neighbor with the combination of admiration and protective reticence that men reserve for people they believe have been treated unjustly by the world. The facts assembled. Gideon Cooper had come to Oklahoma Territory from Missouri in 1876 at the age of 26. He had built his farm from raw land, breaking his first fields alone, sleeping in a sod dugout for 2 winters before the farmhouse was finished. In the spring of 1878, he had married a woman named Clara Hennessy, who had come from a family in Dodge City. They had been married for 14 months. Clara had died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1879, along with the child she had been carrying, a fact that was mentioned only once by anyone by old Bill Drury, and with a quietness that made it clear this was not a subject to push against. He had farmed alone since. He did not drink. He attended church on Sundays with the consistency of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than seeking comfort. He was known for his precision. His fields were the straightest furrowed in the county, his fencing exact, his records immaculate. He helped his neighbors when asked and sometimes before he was asked. He did not talk about himself. Georgia held all of this in her mind for several days, turning it over carefully, the way you turn something fragile. She recognized in his history a shape she understood, the shape of someone who has had their life reorganized by loss into something more spare and more careful than it was before. She recognized it because she had lived in that shape herself, though her losses had been differently dimensioned. She did not allow herself to speculate. She was new in this town, and she had arrived under circumstances that she understood would define her reputation here for some time, and she had work to do and children to teach, and a life to build that could not wait for the luxury of speculation about a quiet farmer who had carried her trunk 3 miles in the rain. She taught school. She established routines. She made the schoolroom warmer with a better stovepipe arrangement that she negotiated from a reluctant school board. She spent her evenings at Mrs. Hooper's, reading or preparing lessons by lamplight. She did not see Gideon Cooper for another 10 days. He came to the school on a Thursday afternoon in early November, when the first serious cold had arrived, and the ground had hardened overnight into something that looked permanent. She was at the blackboard working on long division with the older children when she heard the door, and turned to find him standing in the entrance with his hat in his hands, and 3 cords of firewood neatly stacked behind him in the schoolyard visible through the open door. "The school board asked me to bring firewood before the hard freeze," he said. "I would have come earlier, but my own cutting ran long." She looked at the wood, enough for a solid winter, more than the board had probably ordered. "That is more than the board requested," she said. "The winters here are hard," he said. "The children should not be cold." He stayed exactly long enough to stack 2 of the cords against the schoolhouse wall where they would be most protected from snow. He refused the coffee she offered. He replaced a hinge on the door that had been sticking, which she had not mentioned and which he appeared to have noticed and addressed as a simple matter of course. Before he left, one of her youngest students, a 6-year-old girl named Ida Marsh, who had no shyness whatsoever, said from her seat, "Mister, are you the teacher's husband?" The room went very quiet. Gideon Cooper looked at the child with complete seriousness, as if the question deserved the respect of a serious answer. "No," he said, "I am not." "Are you going to be?" Ida asked. Georgia would have given a great deal for the floor to accommodate her, but it did not. Gideon Cooper looked at her then, not with amusement, not with embarrassment, but with something that was entirely his own kind of expression, open and direct and unhurried, and said, "That is an excellent question, Ida." And then he left. The room erupted. Georgia spent the next several minutes restoring order with the particular firmness of a woman who will not allow herself to be undone by a 6-year-old's theology. And when order was restored, she wrote on the blackboard in large letters, "Focus," and underlined it twice, and did not permit herself to examine what had just happened until she was alone in her room that evening. Then she sat at her window and looked at the cold, dark prairie and thought about it for a long time. He had said it was an excellent question. He had not dismissed it. He had not laughed it away. He had looked at her directly, without performance, with those dark, unhurried eyes, and he had said it was an excellent question. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. She was building a life. She had work. She had standing in this community, fragile and new but real. She had learned, at significant cost, what it meant to build hope on letters from a man she had never met, to travel 1,000 miles toward a promise that dissolved before she arrived. She was not going to make that kind of mistake again. She was not going to make any kind of mistake. She was going to be very, very careful. The social life of Caldwell Creek had a rhythm, and Georgia found herself drawn into it with the gradual inevitability of someone wading into water that is not as cold as expected. The church had a weekly social on Friday evenings, hymn singing, pie, conversation, the particular communal effort of a frontier town to maintain civilization by force of shared tradition. She attended because Mrs. Hooper attended, and because she had quickly come to understand that a schoolteacher's position in a small community requires visible participation in its life. Gideon Cooper attended the church socials. Not every week. Sometimes his farm kept him, or so she assumed from his absence, but often enough that his presence had become part of her Friday evening geography. He sat with Bill Drury and the Hartley brothers, a family of 3 bachelor farmers who occupied a pew toward the back and who were united in their combination of frontier competence and social awkwardness. He sang the hymns in a low baritone that she noticed without meaning to. He ate pie with the same attentive seriousness he appeared to bring to most things. They spoke at these socials with increasing regularity over the weeks of November. Brief conversations at first, the weather, the condition of the roads, whether the school was managing with its new stovepipe arrangement. Then gradually, carefully, longer ones. She discovered that he had read more than she expected. He had a particular interest in agricultural science, the new journals coming out of the land-grant colleges, the experimental work being done on crop rotation and soil improvement, and he discussed these things with an intelligence and precision that surprised her, though it probably should not have. She told him about Cincinnati. Not the failure of it, not the reason she had left, but the texture of the city, the river in winter, the hills, the particular smell of coal smoke and bread from the bakeries on Vine Street on cold mornings. He listened with the quality of attention that she was beginning to recognize as specifically his. Complete, unhurried, not waiting for its turn to speak, but genuinely receiving what she said. He told her, carefully and without excess, about his farm. About the particular character of the Cherokee outlet land, the way it resisted the first breaking, and then yielded to something rich underneath. About his plans for an orchard. He had ordered apple and pear trees from a nursery in Missouri, the first delivery expected in spring. About the way the prairie in certain lights reminded him of the sea, though he had never seen the sea. He did not tell her about Clara. She did not ask. They circled around that absence with the mutual care of 2 people who understand without discussion that some territories need time before they can be entered. December arrived with its particular frontier cruelty, and with it came a development that Georgia had not anticipated, and which reorganized the social landscape of Caldwell Creek in ways she would spend weeks parsing. His name was Franklin Webb. Not Harlan, a different Webb entirely, she confirmed in a moment of cold certainty when she first heard the name, but Franklin Webb, who arrived in Caldwell Creek from Wichita with a fine horse, a good coat, money apparently in some quantity, and the immediate and obvious intention of establishing himself as the most eligible man in the region. Franklin Webb was 32 years old, dark-haired, well-built, and in possession of social skills so polished they made Georgia instinctively look for the machinery underneath them. He had invested in several businesses in Wichita and had come south to acquire land in the Cherokee Outlet before the anticipated changes in territorial policy made land acquisition more expensive. He called on Georgia at Mrs. Hooper's hotel within a week of his arrival, which was either flattering or alarming, and she chose to receive it as neither and simply as a social call to be managed. "Miss Wilcox," he said, "Caldwell Creek speaks very highly of you." "Caldwell Creek has known me for 6 weeks," she said. "That is not enough time for a reliable assessment." He smiled at this, and the smile was practiced and genuinely attractive, and she mistrusted it precisely as much as it attracted her, which was the precise ratio she had learned to maintain with charming men. He called on her 3 more times in December. He was intelligent, well-traveled, and amusing. He talked about the West with the particular excitement of a man who sees it primarily as an opportunity, which was honest at least. He brought her a book, a novel by Mr. Henry James, which she thought was an interesting choice and not an unconsidered one. Mrs. Hooper watched all of this with the unblinking attention of a general at a tactical map. What Georgia noticed, with a clarity that had something unhappy at its center, was that on the Fridays when Franklin Webb attended the church social, Gideon Cooper did not speak to her. He was not rude. He did not make his distance obvious. He simply withdrew, became part of the back pew, part of the general furniture of the room, and left early with Bill Drury. And if she noticed, it was only because she had, apparently, without exactly intending to, been tracking his movements in every room she shared with him. She wanted to be annoyed by this. She was trying to decide if she should be annoyed by this when the incident with the hidden motive became clear. It was Patterson, the storekeeper, who told her, with the reluctance of someone who has decided the withholding of information has become more harmful than the sharing of it. "Franklin Webb," Patterson said, organizing tins with focused attention, "has been buying up water rights on the creek south of town. Quiet-like. The Drury land. The Hartley brothers' east pasture access. And he has been making inquiries about Gideon Cooper's South Field, which is where the best artesian spring in this part of the county is located." Georgia set down the thread she had been purchasing. "He has been making inquiries," she repeated. "Through a land agent out of Wichita," Patterson said. "Word is he wants the water rights enough to cause trouble if he cannot buy them. And Gideon Cooper has said no twice already, which is the kind of answer that men like Franklin Webb do not take as a final one." She walked back to the hotel in the December cold with this information sitting heavily in her chest, the particular weight of a truth that rearranges everything you thought you understood about a situation. Franklin Webb's attention to her had never been. She now understood simply about her. A schoolteacher, new in town, with connections to the local social fabric, including, apparently, connections to Gideon Cooper that were perhaps more visible from outside than she had realized, was a useful instrument if you were trying to acquire land and water rights by pressure and persuasion and the slow cultivation of social leverage. She was furious, not the sharp, hot fury of an immediate insult. The cold, considered fury of someone who has done the calculation and arrived at a number that confirms their worst hypothesis. She had been not deceived exactly, not the way Harlan Webb had deceived her, which had been clean and brutal and done. This was more complex. This was the kind of trap that is built from partial truths and genuine charm, and the very natural human desire to be found attractive by an attractive man. She had not been a fool, but she had been nearly one. She sat at her window that evening and wrote 3 letters. One to a friend in Cincinnati, one to the school board about the spring term, and one that she did not send, that she wrote and then burned in the stove, that was addressed to Gideon Cooper, and that said, among other things, "I am sorry I did not understand sooner what kind of man I was letting take up time in my company when there were better uses for that time." She burned it because she was not ready to say it. But she had said it to herself, and that, she thought, was the beginning of honesty. She declined Franklin Webb's next call with a civility that was unarguable and a finality that was clear to anyone paying attention. He received it with the grace of a man accustomed to tactical retreat, and said something smooth about hoping they would remain friends, and she said of course, and she closed the door and leaned her back against it and breathed and then went upstairs to plan the next week's lessons. It was the Sunday before Christmas when things shifted again, and this time they shifted decisively and without warning. The church that Sunday was crowded. The Christmas service always drew people from the outlying farms, people who attended rarely through the year, and gathered at the year's end by some instinct of communal warmth or spiritual accounting or simple loneliness. Georgia sat with Mrs. Hooper and Margaret Hartley and paid attention to the sermon, which was about shelter and arrival and the significance of ordinary kindness, themes that landed with perhaps more personal weight than Reverend Hartley had intended for any specific member of his congregation. After the service, in the cold, bright December air outside the church, she turned from speaking with Margaret Hartley and found Gideon Cooper beside her, not positioned there by design, it seemed, but by the simple traffic of people moving through the churchyard, and she said, before she thought about it, "I have wanted to speak with you." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "Not now." The churchyard was full, so she said, "Would you, I know this is irregular, but would you take a walk?" He looked at her for a moment, and she thought he might say something about propriety or the cold or some other reasonable objection. He said, "Yes." They walked up the North Road, which was the road he had carried her trunk along in October, a fact that was present for both of them in the way that a shared history is present even when no one names it. The prairie on either side was winter brown and wide, and the sky above it was the particular blue of a cold, clear day that makes the world look very clean. She told him what Patterson had told her about Franklin Webb. He walked beside her, listening, and when she had finished he said, "I know." "You knew when he began calling on me," she said. "I suspected," he said carefully. She stopped walking. "You suspected that he had a dark purpose in cultivating my company, and you did not." She stopped herself. This was not fair, and she knew it. He had not warned her because he had not known what she knew about herself, which was whether she was someone who wanted to be warned. He had made the only choice that was both honest and respectful, which was to withdraw and allow her to make her own assessment. She began walking again. "I am sorry," she said. "That was not a fair thing to be angry about." "You were not angry," he said. "You were startled." "I was both." A beat of quiet. The road was empty ahead of them. "He has come to the farm twice," Gideon said, "with a land agent. Once the South Field and the Artesian Spring. He says the fair price is $400. The spring is worth 3 times that to a man planning to run cattle at scale in this part of the territory. Will he cause trouble if you continue to refuse?" "He will try," Gideon said, simple and without drama. "Men like that have instruments, land agents, lawyers, claims disputes. The territorial government is not always careful about whose interests it serves." He paused. "But the deed is sound. The claim is old and registered. He will find it harder than he thinks." "Is there anything you need?" she asked. He looked at her then, a sideways look that she caught in full because she was watching for it. She had the distinct impression of having surprised him. Not with the question, he was not easily surprised, but perhaps with something underneath it. "I am all right," he said. "That was not what I asked," she said, Another pause. They had walked some distance from the church by now, and the town was a small cluster of shapes behind them in the clear air. "I have a lawyer I wrote to in Wichita," he said finally. "I am managing." "Good," she said. And then, because she had come this far and the December air seemed to support honesty, "I wanted you to know about Webb. That I understand now what his interest was and that it is done. Finished. I wanted you to know that specifically." The pause this time was longer than the others, and it had a different quality. Gideon Cooper walked beside her in the winter light, and she could see him making some internal decision, some deliberate choosing, and she understood without him speaking it that this was not a man who moved quickly toward things, not because of fear but because of a deep and habituated care for the integrity of what he touched. "I am glad you are here," he said finally. "In Caldwell Creek." "Are you?" she said. "Yes," he said, "just that. It was enough. Not everything, not yet. But it was enough to be carrying forward." They walked back to town in the December cold with the sky going gold above the prairie, and when they reached the church where their paths divided, he stopped and looked at her and said, "There is a thing I have been wanting to ask you." She waited. "My sister and her husband come from Kansas City at Christmas and stay through the New Year. There is a dinner on Christmas Eve, just family, and Bill Drury and his wife. Mrs. Hooper is also invited." He paused. "I would like you to come." The simplicity of it, the directness. No performance, no elaborate framing, just the plain declaration of what he wanted. "I would like that very much," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. And she thought she saw briefly, quickly, immediately controlled something that might have been relief move across his face. Christmas Eve on the Cooper farm. She had been trying, over the preceding weeks, not to imagine the farm too specifically, understanding that imagination has a way of building structures that reality is then obligated to either confirm or demolish, and she had had enough demolition lately. But she had imagined some things, and the reality, when the wagon arrived to collect her and Mrs. Hooper at 4 in the afternoon on the 24th of December, was better than what she had imagined, which was a gift she had not expected. The farmhouse was low and solid, built of the yellow limestone that came out of the local creek beds, with a covered porch along the south face and 2 chimneys, both drawing hard in the cold. The yard was neat. The barn behind the house was larger than she would have predicted and kept with the same precision she had come to associate with everything he did. There was an orchard space marked out to the east, the trees not yet planted, but the ground prepared and staked that struck her with unexpected feeling, the sight of a man preparing for a future he had not yet inhabited. His sister was named Ruth, which Georgia thought was an interesting choice of name for a woman who was warm, sharp, funny, and immediately in possession of every important fact about Georgia that could be reasonably obtained in a frontier social setting. Ruth's husband was James Calder, a quiet man from Kansas City who manufactured farm equipment and regarded the Oklahoma Territory with the cautious fascination of a city person who understands he is in a world that operates by different rules. Ruth sat next to Georgia at the dinner table and said, within the first 15 minutes, "He has written to me about you, you know." Georgia looked up from her plate. "Only a little," Ruth said, with a smile that was entirely her brother's, direct and completely honest. "But for Gideon that is a great deal." Georgia was aware of Gideon across the table, speaking with Bill Drury about something agricultural, apparently unaware of what his sister was doing, though she suspected he was more aware than he looked. "What did he say?" she asked, because she had learned that the direct question is usually better than the circling one. "He said there was a woman teaching school who had arrived in difficult circumstances and who had not been unmade by them." Ruth considered her. "That is exactly how he said it, not unmade by them." It is the kind of phrase Gideon uses when he finds something admirable and does not know how else to say it. Georgia looked down at her plate. She was a woman who did not embarrass easily, but she felt, in this moment, something warm moving up through her chest that was more than the proximity of the fireplace. "He is a good man," she said. "He is the best man I know," Ruth said simply. And I know that sounds like a sister talking, but it is true. He has had a harder time than he shows, and he has not let it make him smaller. That is a rare thing in anyone." She paused. "I am very glad you came tonight. After dinner there was a fire and Mrs. Hooper played the small organ that Ruth had apparently brought by wagon from Kansas City as a Christmas gift, and they sang carols in the warm limestone room with the wind moving against the windows outside, and the oil lamps casting their particular gold warmth over everything. Georgia sang and watched Gideon across the room and felt the year reorganizing itself around this moment. The way a story, once you find its real beginning, rearranges everything that came before into coherent preparation. He sat beside her eventually, when the singing had given way to conversation, and they talked about books, the Henry James novel that Webb had brought her, which she had finished by then and had feelings about, and a book of agricultural essays he had ordered from a publisher in Boston that had turned out to contain genuine poetry as well as genuine science, and the works of Mr. Washington Irving, which they both loved, and which led to a 40-minute conversation that covered a great deal of ground and arrived, as the best conversations do, at the sense of having only barely started. When she said good night at the door, bundled for the cold wagon ride back to town, he stood on the porch in the December night without his coat, and she thought she should say something about the cold, and instead she said, "Thank you for asking me." "Thank you for coming," he said, a beat. The stars above the Oklahoma prairie in December were extravagant, a fact that Harlan Webb had gotten right in his first letter and that she had forgotten she already knew. "Will you call on me?" she asked. Because she was not a woman who waited for things to happen to her, not anymore, not when she knew what she wanted. The pause, the look. "Yes," he said, "I will." He called on her the first week of January, and the second, and the third. By February they were the subject of the kind of attention that a small frontier town reserves for things it has collectively decided are worth watching develop, which Georgia bore with the equanimity of someone who has stopped minding being watched when the watching is benign. Mrs. Hooper was barely concealing her satisfaction. Patterson greeted her with a warmth that had a knowing edge. Margaret Hartley had begun referring to Gideon by his first name in Georgia's presence, which was a semiotic shift of considerable local significance. What was happening between them was not the thunderstruck variety of romantic attachment. It was something more specific to who they both were, which was two people who had been badly hurt by trust misplaced, learning very carefully to place it again. It moved in increments. A conversation that went deeper than the last. A look that held a moment longer than comfort required. The discovery of shared laughter, which is always a deeper revelation than shared sadness. He told her about Clara in February. They walked often, both being people who think better in motion on the South Road past his farm, and she had asked about the orchard, whether the trees had arrived from Missouri, and they had, and he was going to plant them in April, and somehow this had led in the way that conversations about the future sometimes do to the past, and he had said in the middle of a sentence about apple varieties, "Clara would have liked this orchard," and then stopped. She waited. He told her. Not everything, she thought, not the deepest part, not yet, but enough. The 14 months, the fever, the child they had not had the chance to name. The way the farm, which he had built as a shared thing, became something he inhabited alone and had to find a different reason to continue building. She did not reach for his hand. She walked beside him in the cold February air and listened the way he had listened to her, which was completely and without rushing toward consolation. When he finished, she said, "I am sorry, truly." "It has been more than a year," he said. "That does not change what it was," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "It does not." They walked back in the gray February light, and at the gate to his farm she stopped and he stopped, and she said, "I need to tell you something." She told him about Harlan Webb. All of it, the 17 letters, the journey, the telegram in the rain. She had told no one in Caldwell Creek the full story. People knew the general fact of her abandoned arrival, but not the specific humiliation of it. She told Gideon now with the deliberate completeness of someone offering an equivalent trust. He listened. She watched his jaw tighten once at the telegram part and then smooth again. "He was a coward," Gideon said. "A man who does that is a coward." "Yes," she said, "he was." "You are not." His voice was different, lower, more direct than usual. "You came here, you stayed. You built something instead of—" He stopped. Then, "You are not easily unmade." There it was. Ruth's phrase, his phrase, the way he saw her. She felt something she could only describe as the sensation of being known. Not perfectly, they were still new to each other, still learning, but accurately. Seen with clear eyes and found not wanting. She looked at him in the February light. "No," she said, "I am not." He kissed her then, and it was, as she would think later, entirely like him. Unhurried, certain, without performance or nervousness. The kiss of someone who has made a decision with the full force of his attention and is not going to hedge it. Spring came to the Cherokee Outlet in late March, and with it came the apple and pear trees from Missouri and the full expansion of Gideon Cooper's orchard plans. And with it also came the thing that Georgia had known was probably coming, but had hoped to have more time to prepare for. Franklin Webb moved to escalate his attempt on the South Field's water rights. The instrument he chose was a territorial land agent named Calhoun, who arrived in Caldwell Creek in early April with a stack of documents that purported to demonstrate a prior claim on a section of the water course that ran through Gideon's land. It was, Georgia assessed immediately, the kind of legal fabrication that is constructed carefully enough to require expensive refutation documents with official-looking seals that were either genuine or very good counterfeits, witness signatures from men who lived far enough away to be difficult to reach. Gideon had engaged his Wichita lawyer, a man named George Elkins, who had a reputation for meticulous work, but Elkins was 2 days' ride away, and the territorial court proceedings moved on their own schedule, which was not always one that favored the defendant. Georgia taught school during the days and spent her evenings at the hotel writing letters. She wrote to every land office, every county records office, every territorial authority she could identify that might hold relevant documentation. She wrote precisely and with reference to specific legal provisions, drawing on the knowledge of her father's business affairs in Cincinnati, which had been unsuccessful in their outcome, but which had given her an education in the instruments of commerce and law that she had never expected to use in an Oklahoma hotel room by lamplight. She also wrote to Elkins herself, enclosing a summary of every document Calhoun had presented and her own analysis of the specific legal weaknesses in each. She was not a lawyer and did not pretend to be, but she had a systematic mind and access to the territorial statutes through the courthouse library, and she found 3 separate procedural irregularities in Calhoun's claim that Elkins confirmed in his reply were not only relevant but potentially dispositive. She told Gideon what she had done on a Tuesday evening at Mrs. Hooper's parlor, where he had come to call. She laid out the letters and the responses and the analysis, and watched him read through them with the focused attention he brought to everything. When he looked up, his expression was something she had not quite seen before. It was complex, something like gratitude and something like wonder, and something underneath both of those that was larger and more serious. "Georgia," he said, "you would have managed without me," she said, because this was true and she needed it to be said before anything else. "I know," he said, "but you—" He stopped. "Why did you do this?" She looked at him across the table in Mrs. Hooper's parlor, with the lamplight on his face and the spring night outside the window, and 4 months of careful, incremental, entirely real feeling behind her. "Because your farm is yours," she said. "Because that spring and that south field and that orchard are yours, and no one has the right to take them from you through fraud. And because—" She stopped. "Because," he said softly, "because I care what happens to you," she said. "Considerably. I have been trying to be careful about that, and I find I cannot be careful enough to prevent it." He set down the papers. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. And he said, in that low certain voice that she had come to know as his most honest register, "I love you, Georgia." The words landed in her chest like something she had not known was missing, and now could not imagine being without. "I love you too," she said. The legal matter was resolved in late April, with Elkins presenting the procedural irregularities and 3 additional documents that established the original claim with finality, and the territorial court dismissing Calhoun's case with a brevity that suggested the judge had not found it much of a close question. Franklin Webb, receiving this news in Wichita through his land agent, apparently decided that the Cherokee Outlet's water rights were not worth further investment of his legal fees and turned his attentions elsewhere. The legal drama was over. The other thing, the larger thing, the thing that had been building since a rain-soaked October evening when a woman stood in the mud outside a stage depot and a man picked up her trunk, was only just beginning. He proposed to her in May, in the orchard. The apple trees were in their first spring growth, small and new in their prepared ground, the pear trees beside them, and the whole east side of the farm smelled of turned earth and green things, and the particular Oklahoma spring that was both wild and tender at once. He had asked her to walk, which was their established language for a serious conversation, and they had come through the farm gate and across the south field to the orchard, and she had known something was coming because he was quieter than usual, not troubled quiet, but gathered quiet, the way he was when he was deciding something fully before speaking it. He stopped in the middle of the orchard and turned to face her and said, "I want to ask you something that I want you to answer only if the answer is yes. If it is not yes, I would rather you simply tell me to ask you again later, and I will wait." She looked at him in the May light in the new orchard on the farm that was solid and beautiful and entirely the product of one man's steadfast work, and felt the year behind them, October's rain, the school, the church socials, the Christmas fire, the February walk, the letters to Elkins, the Tuesday evening at Mrs. Hooper's parlor, felt all of it present and coherent and leading to this. "Ask me," she said. "Will you marry me?" Not decorated, not elaborate. Just the plain question, offered with his whole attention and all of himself behind it. "Yes," she said, just that, because it was what she meant, and she had learned from him that the plain word is always the right one. He put his hands on her face and kissed her in the orchard in the May morning, and the apple trees were in leaf around them, and the sky was the blue that Harlan Webb had described in his first letter, the blue that had turned out to belong to Oklahoma, and not to him at all, but to everything she had actually found here, and Georgia Wilcox, who had come to the frontier in ruins and had built herself a life from the materials at hand, who had been unmade and refused to stay unmade, who had arrived in rain and mud and humiliation and found, 3 miles up a bad road in the company of a quiet and principled man, something she had not known how to hope for, kissed him back with everything she had. They were married on the 14th of June, 1881, 8 months to the day after she had arrived in Caldwell Creek. Reverend Hartley performed the ceremony. Mrs. Hooper cried with the wholehearted satisfaction of someone whose long-range predictions have been confirmed. Ruth and James Calder came from Kansas City. Patterson decorated the general store. The 19 children of Caldwell Creek School arrived in their best clothes, and Ida Marsh, in the front row, whispered loudly to her neighbor, "I told you so," which was accurate and which Georgia heard and did not correct. The ceremony was simple, and the words were the old words, and when Gideon Cooper said, "I do," he said it with the same complete certainty with which he said everything that was true, and Georgia Wilcox, who became Georgia Cooper in that moment, felt the thing settle into place around her with the solidity of limestone and the warmth of a fire that has been built carefully to last. They went to the farm that evening, husband and wife, and the orchard was growing in its proper ground, and the spring was running clear through the south field, and the house smelled of the flowers that Ruth and Mrs. Hooper had cut from the prairie margins and placed in jars on every available surface. That first year of marriage was a year Georgia would return to in her mind for decades, not because it was without difficulty. The farm was hard work, the frontier was hard work, and she was learning a life she had not been raised for, but because it was the year she came fully into herself. She taught school through the fall and winter terms and planted a kitchen garden in the spring. She learned to ride properly, on a good horse Gideon chose for her with his characteristic careful eye. She learned the land, its seasons and its moods and its demands. She learned what it was to share a life with someone whose quality of presence was itself a kind of daily gift. She learned, in ways she had not expected, who she was when she was genuinely happy. Their son was born in the spring of 1882. They named him James William Cooper James for Ruth's husband, who had become a genuine friend over the months of correspondence and visits, and William for Gideon's father, who had died in Missouri the previous year, and whom Gideon had spoken about with the quiet grief of a man who understood what he owed to the people who shaped him. The baby arrived in April, delivered by the doctor from Caldwell Creek in the farmhouse bedroom, while Gideon paced the kitchen below with a controlled anxiety that was the only time Georgia had ever seen him fail to be entirely composed. When the baby's first cry came down through the floorboards, she heard him stop pacing. She heard the silence, and then she heard a sound she could not quite identify, short and quiet and quickly controlled. And when he came upstairs and she put James into his arms, the look on his face was the look of a man who has had something returned to him that he had thought was permanently gone. She reached up and touched his face. He turned and looked at her, and she thought she had never in her life felt less alone. James was a healthy, serious-faced baby who regarded the world from the beginning with the same attentive dark eyes as his father, and who, from his earliest months, showed a disposition toward calm observation, punctuated by moments of sudden decisive action that everyone who knew Gideon recognized immediately and found deeply satisfying. Caldwell Creek grew. The years of the early 1880s were years of settlement and expansion in the Cherokee Outlet as the cattle trade moved and the farming population increased, and the town added a second church, a proper courthouse, a post office, and eventually a real doctor's office with a surgery. Georgia's school grew to 31 students, and she pressed the school board for an assistant teacher, a campaign she waged over 2 years with the patient persistence of someone who has learned that most things worth having require sustained attention to achieve. She got the assistant teacher in 1883, a young woman named Miss Eva Crane from Illinois, fresh from normal school, full of enthusiasm and thoroughly terrified by the prairie, whom Georgia took under her wing with the particular competence of someone who remembers exactly what it felt like to arrive in a strange place with no road map. Gideon's orchard had reached bearing age. This was, she later thought, one of the greatest pleasures of those years, watching the orchard grow toward its purpose. The apple trees fruited for the first time in the fall of 1883, and she and Gideon stood in the October orchard. The same October light as that first year, 3 years on now, with James on Gideon's shoulders and the trees heavy with their first real harvest, and the feeling was specific and incomparable. The feeling of the future you planned arriving exactly as you envisioned it, which almost never happens and which, when it does, is among the most profound experiences available to a human being. They made cider that fall for the first time and gave jars of it to every household in Caldwell Creek, including a jar for Mrs. Hooper, who drank it with the expression of someone receiving something they have been owed for a while, and a jar for Patterson, who displayed it in the store window for 2 weeks before opening it. Bill Drury, who was older and slower now but still farming his adjacent land, came to help with the harvest for 3 days, and told Gideon over supper one evening that Clara would have been proud of the orchard. And Gideon said yes, she would have. And the words sat quietly in the room and Georgia let them sit, and did not feel diminished by them. because she had long since understood that love is not a finite thing that must be rationed. And that Gideon's history was part of what had made him who he was, and who he was precisely the man she loved. She was expecting their second child by Christmas of 1883. This pregnancy was different from the first, not easier exactly, but different in its emotional texture, which was less anxious and more simply present. She taught school through January, when the cold made the walk difficult, and rested in February and planned in March. And in April of 1884, the same April month as James, which delighted her, their daughter was born. They named her Clara Ruth. It was Georgia who had suggested it. She had thought about it for months before raising it, turning the question over, examining it from every angle, trying to understand her own motives fully before acting on them. She had raised it on a quiet evening by the fire, with James asleep in his room and the spring prairie dark outside the windows, and Gideon had been very still when she said it. "Clara Ruth," she said, "if you would like." He had looked at her for a long time. "Georgia," he said, and then stopped. "She was part of your life," Georgia said, "part of who you are. Our daughter should know that her father has loved more than once, and that none of it is hidden or shameful. And Ruth is your sister, who I love. I want both in our daughter's name." He crossed the room and held her with his whole body and said nothing for a considerable time, and when he did speak it was very quietly, and she felt his voice against her hair, and he said, "I do not know what I did to deserve you." "You carried my trunk," she said. She felt him laugh, one of the rare, real laughs that were among the things she loved most about him. 3 miles in the rain," he said, and said it was no trouble, she said. "It was no trouble," he said. "I know," she said. That was the whole point. Clara Ruth Cooper arrived in April 1884 and immediately distinguished herself by being louder, more decided, and more immediately opinionated about the conditions of her existence than her brother had been. James, who was 2.5 and had his father's capacity for observation, sat beside her cradle on the first day and studied her with great seriousness, and then announced that she was acceptable, which Georgia recorded in the journal she kept. The school board had, over the years of her tenure, moved from respectful tolerance to genuine admiration of Georgia's work, a trajectory she had moved along through the patient application of competence and the occasional pointed argument when necessary. In the fall of 1884, they formally increased the school's budget enough for proper textbooks for all students, the replacement of the drafty north window, and a small salary increase that was not large but was genuine acknowledgement. She was proud of the school in the way you are proud of something you have built from less than it deserved. She had watched children arrive who had never held a pen and leave able to read, to calculate, to write their own names and histories. The 2 children of the Cheyenne settler marriage, Eli and Sarah Brightwater, had both proved to be among the brightest students she had ever taught, and she had spent considerable energy ensuring they received the same instruction and the same expectations as every other child in the room, resisting the particular frontier prejudice that would have given them less, because Georgia Wilcox had been raised to understand that the withholding of education from any child is a specific and inexcusable injustice, and she was not going to preside over it. Eli Brightwater eventually went to study at the Indian school in Kansas, a fact that Georgia considered among the meaningful accomplishments of her teaching years. Gideon had expanded the farm by 1885. He had purchased the east 40 acres when they became available and incorporated them into the operation, diversifying into a small cattle herd alongside the crops and the orchard, which now yielded enough fruit that he was selling to merchants in 2 adjacent towns. The farm was prosperous, not wealthy, but solidly, durably prosperous, the kind of financial security that comes from knowing what you are doing and doing it without waste or pretension. He had also, over the years, become less isolated socially, not because he had changed his nature, which was still essentially private, but because he had allowed the community to reach him through the doorway Georgia represented. She was a natural connector, a woman who moved through the social world with interest and ease, and some of her ease had transferred to their shared life in a way that had opened spaces he had not previously inhabited. He had friends now, genuine ones. He served one term on the school board. He helped organize the first cooperative grain storage arrangement in the county, a project that benefited a dozen farming families, and that he managed with the same careful precision as everything else. The 5th anniversary of their marriage, June 1886, arrived with an Oklahoma summer in full force, the prairie grass tall and the orchard lush and James 4 years old, and Clara not yet 2, and the farmhouse full of the particular domestic music of a family in its proper life. Georgia made a plan for the occasion. She had been planning it for months in the way she planned things with quiet thoroughness. She arranged for Mrs. Hooper, who had sold the hotel the previous year, and was now living with her daughter across town, but who remained the most reliable conspirator Georgia knew, to take the children for the afternoon. She arranged a picnic basket from the contents of her kitchen, cold chicken, preserved pears from last fall's orchard, fresh bread, and a bottle of the wine that Ruth and James Calder had sent from Kansas City for the occasion. She took Gideon to the orchard. They sat in the afternoon shade of apple trees that were, by now, substantial and full canopied, providing real shade in the summer heat. The smell of ripening fruit already in the air, though the main harvest was months away. She spread the blanket and unpacked the basket, and they ate and talked and let the afternoon slow down around them. She had brought something in the basket that she had been carrying for 5 years, something she had not shown him before. She reached to the bottom of the basket and found the small tin. She opened it and took out the folded paper, small now, handled many times, the ink long since dried and set in its bled shape. She placed it in his hand. He unfolded it. He read it. Miss Wilcox Harlan Webb married Dorothy Frane of Enid. Do not come to the ranch. He looked at her. I kept it, she said. I told you that the evidence of a betrayal is useful to carry. I have carried it 5 years. I kept it because I needed to remember what I survived, and because, she paused, because without this piece of paper I am not in Caldwell Creek in the rain in October 1880. I am somewhere else entirely, living some other life entirely, and I cannot imagine that. He turned the telegram over in his hands, looking at it for a long time. Then he looked at her across the blanket in their orchard, with the afternoon light in the apple trees and the Oklahoma summer loud with insects and wind, and the look on his face was the look she knew best and loved most, that particular direct, unhurried attention that had been the first thing she recognized about him. Thank you for keeping it, he said. Do you want to burn it, she asked. He looked at the telegram for one more moment. No, he said. Put it back in your tin. It belongs to you. She put it back. She closed the tin. He reached across the blanket and took her hand. They sat in the orchard in the June afternoon, the orchard he had planted in preparation for a future he could not yet see, on the land he had built from raw ground, in the life they had made together from the materials of two people's specific losses, and Georgia felt the complete, particular piece of a life that is exactly where it is supposed to be. What are you thinking? She asked. That I should bring a blanket to the orchard more often, he said, which made her laugh. That is all. A pause. The way he paused. I am thinking that you made everything better, he said. Everything that was here before you was good enough, but you made it better. The farm, the orchard, me. He looked at her. Especially me. She moved across the blanket, and he put his arm around her, and they sat with their backs against one of the apple trees, and the sky above the Cherokee Outlet was the blue that had been promised in a letter she had once pressed against her chest at night as a remedy, and that had turned out to be real after all, and available to her, and hers. The year 1887 brought change to the Cherokee Outlet in the form of increased government pressure on the territorial land arrangements, a harbinger of the eventual land rush that Georgia and Gideon both understood was coming, the irreversible westward press of settlement that was already reshaping the territories. Gideon spent considerable time that year securing his land records and ensuring every piece of his claim was beyond challenge. the lesson of Franklin Webb's attempted fraud having permanently sharpened his attention to documentation. Franklin Webb himself had, by report, moved his operations to Texas, and then apparently to California, following the frontier's opportunities with the portable, rootless ambition of men who invest in places rather than belonging to them. Georgia heard his name mentioned once in a telegraph office conversation and felt nothing in particular about it, which she noted as evidence of something being well and truly finished. The territorial politics were complicated, and the injustices embedded in the land arrangements, the pressure on Cherokee and Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, the steady erosion of the agreements that had given the territory its name, were real and present, and Georgia did not allow herself to look past them. She had watched the Brightwater family navigate the particular hardship of living on land that the dominant culture was in the process of deciding belonged to settlers rather than its original inhabitants, and she had done what she could, which was not enough, which was never enough, but which she did consistently, and without pretending the situation was other than it was. She raised her children to know this. She taught it in her school with the same plainness with which she taught everything else. The frontier's romance, she told her students, is real, and the frontier's cost to those who paid it without choosing to is also real, and a person who loves this land honestly must hold both truths together. James Cooper, at 7 years old, sat in his father's orchard and listened to his mother explain this and asked, with his father's precision, "What do we do about it?" And Georgia said, "We make sure the people who come after us know the truth. We treat every person as a full person. And we do not pretend the hard things did not happen because pretending is easier." James considered this and said, "All right," and went back to helping his father thin the apple crop, which was what his attention required next. Clara Ruth, at 4, had no patience for long explanations and a great deal of patience for climbing apple trees, which she had been doing since she was tall enough to reach the lowest branch, and which Gideon watched with the expression of a man who has simultaneously accepted the inevitable and resolved to catch her if she falls. The second decade of Georgia's life in Caldwell Creek settled into the rhythms of the established. The school was well run and well regarded. Miss Crane had become an excellent teacher in her own right and eventually took over the primary grades, allowing Georgia to focus on the older students and the institutional aspects of running the school. The farm was prosperous and growing. The orchard was extraordinary. Their third child came in 1888, another son, born in the autumn this time, who came into the world in the middle of an October thunderstorm of the kind that the Oklahoma Territory produced with theatrical enthusiasm. They named him Thomas Elliott Cooper, Thomas for no particular reason except that it suited him, which became apparent almost immediately, and Elliott because Georgia had always loved the name, and Gideon had said yes with the ease of a man who trusts his wife's judgment about most things. Thomas proved to be the most energetic member of the Cooper family by some considerable margin, a distinction he established early and maintained without effort. He walked at 10 months and ran at 10 months and 1 week, and thereafter was in continuous motion through every waking hour of his existence, which was the source of equal parts joy and exhaustion for everyone around him. James, 8 years older, appointed himself his youngest brother's supervisor with great seriousness and partial effectiveness. Clara, 6 years older, simply ignored Thomas's chaos with the serene indifference of someone who has her own agenda and intends to pursue it. Georgia sat on the farmhouse porch one evening in the October of 1890, 10 years after she had arrived in Caldwell Creek, and tried to locate the woman who had stood in the rain outside the stage depot with a telegram dissolving in her hands. She could remember her precisely, the particular quality of that despair, the specific texture of having traveled 1,000 miles toward a door that had been locked before she arrived. She could remember it without flinching now, which she took as evidence of genuine healing rather than mere forgetting. Gideon came out onto the porch and sat beside her. The evening was the particular October evening of the Oklahoma Territory, cool and clear and enormous, the sky going from orange to deep blue above the prairie, the orchard dark against the light. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. He found her hand in the fading light. Do you remember what Patterson said to me the first week I was here? She asked. You will have gentlemen callers. About the most confident prediction anyone has ever made, given that I had just arrived abandoned in the rain. Gideon smiled, the real, private smile she knew was only for her and their children, the one that had taken months to appear and that she still felt as a gift every time she saw it. Patterson has always been a perceptive man, he said. He is also a gossip, she said. The two are not incompatible, Gideon said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and they sat in the falling October dark, and the children were inside, James at the table doing his lessons, Clara reading with the focused attention she had developed early and used like a tool, Thomas almost certainly not doing whatever he had been asked to do, and the farm was quiet around them with the settled quiet of a place that has found its full use. I want to show you something, she said. She went inside and came back with the tin. She sat beside him and opened it. The dried lavender had long since given up its scent, but remained in the tin in small, fragrant pieces, habit and sentiment keeping it there. The telegram was still folded small. She touched it without taking it out. 10 years ago, she said, I was standing in the mud outside the stage depot reading this telegram for the third time, trying to find an arrangement of the words that meant something other than what they meant. And you picked up my trunk. She looked at him. I need you to know that it was everything, not just the carrying it, though that was what I saw first. It was the not asking. It was the not making me explain. It was the walking 3 miles in the rain with 112 pounds of everything I owned, and saying it was no trouble and meaning it. I knew then not what would happen. I did not know that, but who you were, what kind of man. He was quiet for a moment. The night was coming in now over the prairie. I picked up your trunk, he said, because you were standing in the mud in the rain reading a piece of paper with your back very straight, and I understood enough of what it meant to understand that the least I could do was not make you ask for help. He paused. I did not think about it. I just picked it up. I know, she said. That was the whole point. He turned and kissed her temple and then her cheek, and she turned her face to his, and they sat on the porch of their limestone farmhouse in the October night with 10 years of built life behind them, and the prairie dark and enormous and full of its particular wild continuance all around them. And she thought, this is what it means to be fortunate. Not the absence of hard things, but the presence, in the middle of the hard things, of someone who picks up your trunk and walks 3 miles and says it was no trouble and means it. The land rush of April 1889 had brought thousands of new settlers to the unassigned lands adjacent to the Cherokee Outlet, and the subsequent pressure on the outlet's own status had been building throughout 1890 and 1891. By 1893, the outlet itself was open to settlement in the great run of September of that year, and the territory that had once been a relatively quiet frontier edge became something else, more crowded, more contested, more connected to the wider world by rail and telegraph, and the sheer accumulating presence of people. Caldwell Creek became a proper town with a proper newspaper, a proper bank that had replaced the original small one, and a school district that eventually covered 4 separate buildings. Georgia served on the school board for 6 years beginning in 1892, a role she took with the same seriousness and strategic patience she had brought to everything since the day she arrived. James Cooper grew up to be his father's son in the ways that mattered and his mother's in the ways that mattered differently. He worked the farm through his teenage years with genuine capability, and eventually, when he was 19, announced that he wanted to study agricultural engineering at the new state college in Stillwater, a plan his parents received with the satisfaction of people whose investment in their children's future has paid a return that exceeds what they had dared to plan. Clara Ruth Cooper was 11 when James left for college and 12, when she announced, with total clarity, that she intended to become a doctor. Georgia's response to this was to immediately write to 3 medical schools to ask about their admissions policies for women, which was both characteristic and, in 1895, fairly hopeful given the state of institutional medicine's views on the subject. She found a path eventually. It took years and involved considerable persistence on Clara's part and considerable support on her parents, but she got there. Thomas Eliot Cooper remained in continuous motion through his childhood and adolescence, and eventually channeled the energy into ranching, for which he had a genuine gift, establishing his own operation south of Caldwell Creek on land he and Gideon purchased together when Thomas was 20, a transaction that Georgia witnessed with the particular emotion of seeing a family enterprise pass from one generation to the next. The 19th century turned into the 20th in Caldwell Creek with a modest celebration that Reverend Hartley's successor, Reverend Hartley himself having retired to live with a daughter in Kansas City, organized at the church, and Georgia and Gideon stood in the midnight cold on the 1st of January 1900 and looked at the stars above the Oklahoma prairie and thought whatever people think when they stand at the hinge of a century. She was 44. He was 49. They had been married 19 years. She had been in Oklahoma for 20. "What do you think comes next?" she asked. "More of this," he said. "Adjusted for weather," she laughed. "I mean it," he said. More of exactly this. The farm, the orchard, the children visiting, more grandchildren eventually, more of every good thing for as long as we are given it. She looked at him in the new century's first night. He was, she thought, the finest person she had known. Not because he was without difficulty. She knew his difficulties and he knew hers, and they had been navigating them together for 2 decades. But because he had never, in all that time, been anything other than what he appeared to be. He had never performed goodness. He had never required credit for it. He had picked up her trunk and walked and said it was no trouble, and it had been the truest possible beginning. She put her arms around him in the cold. More of exactly this, she agreed. The first grandchild arrived in 1903, James's son, whom they named Henry William Cooper, and who had his grandfather's eyes and his grandmother's absolute certainty about what he wanted. Thomas, married by then to a rancher's daughter from the southern county, contributed 2 more grandchildren in quick succession, and the Cooper farmhouse took on the particular Sunday character of a place where multiple generations of related people arrive and fill every chair, and the noise level requires a certain amount of resilience. Georgia taught at the Caldwell Creek School until she was 53 years old, when she retired from the classroom to what she described as educational administration, which meant serving on the board, advocating at the state level for rural school funding, and maintaining the correspondence and institutional energy that had made the school district one of the better ones in the region. The farm was extraordinary by then. The orchard that Gideon had staked out and prepared before the first trees arrived. The orchard that had been a future he was building before he knew for whom was 40 acres of mature, productive trees that supplied 3 counties and employed seasonal labor every harvest. They had added a small cider press, properly built, that produced what the Caldwell Creek Courier called a product of genuine distinction, which was the kind of thing small-town newspapers say when they mean it. Gideon Cooper, in his later years, achieved the specific dignity of someone whose life has proved out what it promised. He was known throughout the county as a man of complete reliability, a man whose word was not a preliminary to a contract, but the contract itself, a man who helped his neighbors with the same quiet, unhesitating competence with which he had always helped them. He served as a justice of the peace for several years. He was asked more than once to run for the state legislature and declined with a consistent graciousness that suggested he had thought about it genuinely and decided it was not where he was most useful. He was most useful on the farm, most himself there. He said this without apology and without false modesty, and Georgia loved him for it, as she had always loved him for the particular honesty with which he understood himself. In the summer of 1910, when Georgia was 54 and Gideon 59, and they had been married 29 years and James was 28 with his own family, and Clara was 26, and in her medical practice and Thomas was 22 and prospering. There was a harvest evening in the orchard when all 3 children and all the grandchildren who were old enough came to help, and they worked through the afternoon in the September light among the apple trees. And at evening they built a fire at the orchard's edge and ate together in the fading light. Georgia sat beside Gideon in the firelight and watched their family around them and felt the fullness of it, the complete, rounded fullness of a life that had been built from grief and rain, and the specific grace of an unhurried man carrying a heavy trunk up a muddy road. She had been afraid, for a long time, that she was someone who did not get to have this, that the kind of life that was full and real and warm and permanent belonged to people whose starting circumstances were different from hers. She had been afraid of hoping for too much. She had been afraid of the distance between what she wanted and what she could claim. She had been wrong. "I was wrong about something," she said to Gideon in the firelight. He looked at her. "Often," he said, with the dry private humor she had known for 30 years. "About whether this was available to me," she said. "When I first came here, I thought that the good things, the solid, real, lasting good things were for people who hadn't made the mistakes I'd made or ended up where I'd ended up. I thought I was building something lesser because I was starting from a lesser place." He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was listening completely. "And now," he said, "now I think the starting place is completely irrelevant," she said. "I think the only thing that matters is whether the thing you build is real, and what we have is real." She looked at him. "The most real thing I have ever known." He put his arm around her in the harvest evening, among their family in their orchard, on the land he had broken from raw ground and that they had made together into the particular kind of place that holds memory and grows things simultaneously, and he said, "It has always been real." It had. From the beginning, from the moment he had bent over a broken trunk rope in October rain and made a decision that was simple and unhurried and entirely him, from the 3 miles up a mud road and the plain statement that it was no trouble, from the first moment she had seen who he was and held that knowledge with careful hands while she learned everything else about him. It had always been real. The tin with the dried lavender and the telegram sat on Georgia Cooper's dressing table for the rest of her life. Her children knew it was there. Clara, who had her mother's directness, asked once what was in it, and Georgia told her, and Clara held the telegram with the seriousness she brought to everything and said, "And that is why you came here?" And Georgia said yes, and Clara said, "Then I am grateful to a man I have never met," and put it back in the tin. Thomas, who had never heard the story in full, heard it one Sunday at the farm and was quiet for a long time and then said, with the simplicity of someone who has had a thing clarified that was previously approximate, "So that is who Papa is." And Georgia said yes, that is exactly who he is. The farm ran for decades after they were gone, passed to James and then to Henry, who maintained the orchard with the careful attention of someone who understands they are the custodian of something that was built with more intention than most people bring to anything. The limestone farmhouse stood for a long time. The orchard stood longer. But before all of that, before the decades and the children grown and the grandchildren and the harvest evenings and the long arc of 2 lives made into one, there was the rain. There was the rain and the mud and a broken rope, and a woman reading a telegram 3 times, looking for a different set of words. And a man who came up behind her without making a noise and crouched over her trunk and stood and picked it up without asking, and started walking north and said 3 miles later when she thanked him that it was no trouble. It was no trouble. She had known in that moment what those words meant. She had known them not as courtesy but as truth. She had known them as the words of someone for whom the help of another person is not a burden to be weighed against convenience, but simply a thing that you do when it needs doing, without record keeping, without the expectation of credit, without the performance of generosity. She had known then who he was. She had not yet known that she would love him. She had not known that she would marry him in June 6 months later, or that they would stand in an orchard in May to become engaged, or that they would have 3 children who would go out into the world and do real things, or that she would sit on a farmhouse porch 30 years later and feel the particular complete peace of a life that is exactly where it is supposed to be. She had only known what kind of man he was. And it had turned out that knowing what kind of man he was had been exactly enough. It had been the only thing she needed to know. The rest had been time and attention and the willingness of 2 careful people to trust each other with the real and fragile contents of themselves. The rest had been every conversation and every walk and every evening by the fire and every harvest and every year of the prairie sky that was exactly the blue that had been promised. The rest had been the life they built. And it was real. It was the most real thing either of them had ever known. It had been real from the very beginning. From the moment he picked up her trunk and walked, and the rain came down, and the road went north toward everything that was going to happen. From the moment he said it was no trouble, and meant it.